Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I was first in Prague before you were born. I was here in the summer of 1968. I got out, the tanks came in. Now I say that because Africa has had as momentous events, more momentous events even, than the Czech Republic. You've just celebrated 20 years of liberation from a form of tyranny. Africa has been through a range of earthquake events since decolonization. And I'm here to pay honor and my own respects to the name of Kapuscinski, because Kapuscinski was the journalist, the great chronicler of these earthquake events. He was an extraordinary man. He was a Polish journalist. And you must think back to the times of the communist era and how the position of a Polish journalist working in Africa and Iran. He was intrinsically a marginal figure, and yet he identified with ordinary people in extraordinary times and provided these absolutely riveting chronicles. I really recommend you to read them. They're fascinating and illuminating depictions of truly historic events. And his legacy is that, having produced these chronicles, for years and years to come, as people look back on these extraordinary times, and in particular as Africans look back on the earthquakes, the political earthquakes that created modern Africa, they'll look to him as the I think, foremost chronicler of these events. Now, Africa is a huge and diverse place, so you can't really come up with many generalizations about it. But in my little book, The Bottom Billion, I tried to set out a narrative of a group of countries. You can think of it as Africa Plus, about 60 little countries. Not all in Africa, and not all of Africa is in the bottom billion. South Africa certainly isn't. But a class of little countries that, from the 1970s to around the millennium, had basically stagnated. Because they've stagnated, they've diverged from the rest of mankind. 40 years ago, when I was your age, a student, and when people studied development, the world was kind of divided into a 1 billion lucky people in rich countries and a 5 billion people in developing countries. And that is no longer true. Over my lifetime, the world has fundamentally changed so that a 1 billion, 5 billion, lucky billion, the rest of the world developing, is no longer characterized as what's going on. Most of that 5 billion are developing at rates without historical precedent. They're converging on the lucky billion. They're converging so fast that the lucky billion are quite alarmed sometimes. We no longer look at China and say, isn't it poor? We say, China, help. About 4 billion of the 5 billion are living in countries that are either already at middle income levels or are converging so fast that it's a miracle. That leaves 1 billion people living in these 60 or so countries at the bottom of the global economy that have stagnated and therefore diverged from the rest of mankind. So we're now in a world of a sort of 1 billion at the bottom, 1 billion at the top, and 4 billion in the middle converging. And my story is the billion at the bottom. these countries that somehow, for one reason or another, missed out on the unprecedented prosperity of the last 30 or 40 years. The 4 billion in the middle, many of those people are still poor. Some of them are as poor as the people in the bottom billion. But there's a fundamental difference between being poor in China and equally poor in Chad. And that difference is one word: hope. If you're poor in China, as an adult, you might stay poor for the rest of your life, but you've got credible prospects that your children will grow up into a society of transformed economic opportunity. And if you're poor in Chad, you don't have any basis for credible hope that your children will grow up in an environment different from your own. In fact, if you're poor in Chad and you're worried about your children, the only credible strategy is get out of Chad, which people try. And so the challenge of development looking forward, to my mind, is not, in fact, even these Millennium Development Goals, which are still tracking progress of the 5 billion. The challenge is to get the bottom billion to catch up with everybody else. And that's a more daunting challenge than just reducing poverty. Until the global crisis, China and India were growing at astounding rates. They still are. In fact, the gap between the bottom billion and the next 4 billion, even by the millennium, the gap was 5 to 1, and it was widening at 5% a year. And so the challenge is not, let's try and reduce poverty in the bottom billion. That's much too modest a goal. The goal has to be to replace divergence by convergence. The bottom billion have to catch up with the rest of mankind. And that's a daunting challenge because those emerging market economies in the middle are, on average, growing very fast. So convergence means moving from stagnation to really rapid growth. That's the challenge. Why should we meet that challenge? It's a mixture of compassion. These are the poorest people on earth, 1 billion people living without credible hope. And so ordinary human compassion demands that we strive to change that situation, a situation which persisted for decades. And compassion is allied with self-interest. Because in a globalized world, having a continent so close to Europe, in which millions, hundreds of millions, 1 billion people are living without credible hope, is a potential nightmare. And so both compassion and enlightened self-interest point in the same direction. We need to try and help. And we need to try and help intelligently. To understand how to help, we need some sort of diagnosis of why the countries of the bottom billion missed out on prosperity. And there is no single diagnosis. I'm a development economist, and for years, because I'm such an old development economist, I've seen the fashions change. And they even, the same ideas come back after about 25 years because people have forgotten they had them. So some years it's education, some years it's agriculture. It changes. There's always one big idea. And you can be sure after 40 years of study, it's always wrong. There is no big single explanation. In my book, The Bottom Billion, I try to suggest what I think of as the major difficulties, which I call traps. And I'll just run through them briefly. Some of them are paradoxical. One, which I want to return to, is the natural resource trap. It's the paradox, which is common in Africa and in a number of other countries, like the stands in Central Asia, that they have very valuable natural resources, which should be a massive opportunity for prosperity, and occasionally is. Botswana is a good example of a country in Africa which harnessed natural resources for sustained prosperity. But usually, these natural assets, these natural resources, instead of being the platform for prosperity, they've been the premise for plunder. And so the contest for control has so soured the political process that it's led to stagnation or even destruction. So Nigeria stagnated. It would have been better off without its oil. Sierra Leone was destroyed by diamonds. The same diamonds that built Botswana destroyed Sierra Leone. So that's one very paradoxical trap, resource riches. Another rather paradoxical trap, given where I'm speaking, is being landlocked. You're landlocked. It's not been a problem for you. But it is a problem both for the many countries in Africa that are landlocked and for the stands in Central Asia that are landlocked. Why is it a problem for them but not a problem for you? If you're landlocked, what matters is your neighbours. If you're landlocked with bad neighbours, that's a nightmare. If you're landlocked with prosperous neighbours, that's fine. Right? Nowadays, Czechs don't wake up and think, if only Germany would sink into the sea, we could reach our market. There was a time 70 years ago when you probably rather wished that Germany would sink into the sea, right? And that's a different story. The reason you don't think if only Germany would sink into the sea we could reach our market is that Germany is your market. You're surrounded by prosperous countries that you can sell into. And then try saying that if you're, say, Uganda. I was in Uganda last month, and you just look at the neighborhood, and you say, oh, good, we're next door to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is distinguished by the fact that it's certainly not democratic. It's not, in any meaningful sense, a republic. The leader is the son of the former leader. He inherited the position, so it's more like an absolute monarchy. And it's even stretching it to call it the Congo, because actually there's another country called the Congo. It's like the Democratic People's Republic of Libya or something, you know. When countries proclaim these names too vociferously, you start to suspect that actually they're the opposite of their nomenclature. So, landlocked with bad neighbours characterises the stands, and it characterises quite a lot of Africa. Not Botswana. Botswana's lucky. It's got some good neighbours. But Uganda, for example, its problem is not only are its neighbours not growing enough to provide a market, but it's not even got reliable access to the sea. To get to the sea, it has to go through Kenya, and the Kenyan government has never invested in the road and rail connections which would make transport for Uganda to the sea feasible. And so Uganda's in a lock caused by its bad neighbours. And that cuts off a lot of development opportunities. Now, outside of Africa, very few people live in countries that are landlocked and don't have valuable resources. In fact, only 1% of the developing world outside Africa lives in such countries. In Africa, it's about 30%. Another way of saying that same statistic is that outside of Africa, places that are landlocked and don't have any valuable resources haven't become countries. they become parts of other countries with better opportunities. And in Africa, unfortunately, these places did become countries. There's nothing to be done about it now. But that's the historic legacy of kind of dysfunctional political fragmentation. So, resource riches which turn the politics sour have been one trap. Being landlocked with bad neighbours has been another trap. Violent conflict has been a third trap. Once you're into violent conflict, it's proved very, very hard to get out of it. Civil wars are highly persistent. They last more than 10 times as long as international wars. Very hard to stop them. And the legacy effects are usually very worrying as well. The main legacy of civil war is a heightened risk of further civil war. We see that risk in Africa now because at the millennium quite a few violent conflicts were settled, and now some of them, such as Sudan, are looking fragile again. So these are examples of the sort of traps that have locked the countries of the bottom billion into stagnation for long periods. Let's think more what can be done about it. There's a very limited scope for international solutions to these problems that societies, in the end, have to save themselves. And so, do not imagine for a moment that we can save Africa. We can't. Africa will save Africa. Africans will turn the situation round, and in some countries they already are doing. There are intense struggles going on really across Africa, in all African societies, between people fighting for change and people trying to preserve their own self-interest in the status quo. And those struggles are being played out. We are, as outsiders, we're marginal players. But we have a responsibility to do what we can to tilt the balance. And often we can be influential in that internal struggle, but we should never lose sight of the fact that it is fundamentally an internal struggle. So what can we do? Two things. One is we need to focus down on the problem. Remember, the problem has changed. It's not the problem of 40 years ago. It's not even the problem set out by the Millennium Development Goals, these multidimensional problems amongst 5 billion people around the world. It's just not that. The problem is shrunk to a smaller core of countries. And in that sense, it's easy. Focus makes it a much more manageable problem. We've got limited resources, and we should focus those resources down on the countries that now need it most. So that's one thing we can do. Focus down on the real problem. And then secondly, having focused down on the real problem, we should broaden the array of policies that we use. It's not just about our money. There's an intense, rather nasty and very silly debate about whether aid is part of the problem or it's the solution. To my mind, aid is clearly part of the solution, not part of the problem, but it's a relatively minor part of the solution. Money matters, but it's not going to be central. And what we forget is that we've got many other policies that affect the development process. Now, you in the Czech Republic are in a better position to understand that than most, because you have been through that transformation out of socialism, one-party state, and economic stagnation. You've been through that transition over the last 20 years. You've just celebrated that. And that's the transition that a lot of these societies have to go through. And so think, what part did the international community, particularly the European community, play in that transition? Part of it was money, but it was much broader than money. Think of some of the other policies that help, and which have helped across Eastern Europe. Indeed, to my mind, the best predictor of progress since 1989 in the former Soviet Union countries is to what extent they had credible prospects of joining the European Union. The more your geography gave you credible prospects of joining the European Union, the more successful has been the transition. What did the European Union offer? Yes, it offered some money, but it also offered integration into trade, so it opened markets. And so trade policy, market access, is fundamental for shaping the opportunities which Africa faces. Europe has various special schemes for Africa. They're not very good, in my mind. This is one area in which I think we don't compare very well with America. Both Europe and America have schemes for Africa. Europe's scheme, until very recently, was called Everything But Arms. America's scheme was called the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And I've evaluated them both. And a go at the American scheme works, and broadly, Everything But Arms doesn't. And here's the evidence that, to my mind, one of the key things that trade policy can do for Africa is to enable Africa to diversify out of extreme dependence upon a narrow range of primary commodities. It can help Africa to break in to light manufactures, the sort of transition that Asia made. That was the fundamental transition in Asia, breaking into global markets for light manufacturers, that took Asia out of poverty. And so that ought to happen in Africa. It's much harder for Africa to do it than for Asia to do it. Much harder, because Asia is now an established low-wage producer. When Asia broke into global markets, there was no low-wage producer. That was Asia. And so it had a huge competitive advantage against the developed countries in manufactured markets in the form of cheap labour, which just offset a whole load of other competitive disadvantages. That's why Asia broke in. And then, as the manufacturing clusters built in East Asia, they were able to reap the scale economies that come from a lot of firms being clustered together. And that's why the growth process of manufacturers in Asia was explosive. Let me give you the one number that you'll probably remember from this lecture in a year's time, and it concerns buttons. 2/3 of the world's buttons are made in one city. I think that's quite amazing, really. It's in China, and a quarter of a century ago, it wasn't even a city, it was a village. So why on earth are 2/3 of buttons now made in this place? It's not that Mega Button Incorporated is located there. Right? There is no Mega Button Incorporated. There's just lots of little button firms all bunched together. So why have they bunched there? Is it if you scratch the ground you find buttons? No, right? There's no natural advantage there at all. It's that by clustering together, button firms have found that their costs are lower. You know, you can be sure if a button machine breaks down in your factory and you want fast repair of a specialist machine, you can find it in Buttonopolis, right? And now imagine being the first firm in Africa to produce buttons for the global market. and suppose your wages are the same, and the infrastructure is the same, and all the rest. You know what? You're going to go bankrupt. Because all these other, the big disadvantages, you're the first one. And so our trade policy can offset the disadvantage of being the pioneer firms lose money. It's a chicken and egg problem that Africa faces. If only it could get manufacturing clusters, they might well be competitive. But the process of building them up, during that process, they lose money. And so Africa needs a privileged access to our markets, privileged vis-à-vis the established low-income producers. That's what the American scheme has offered, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. It's very far from perfect. It only works in one narrow dimension, which is garments. But there it does work. And since it was established in about 2001, African garments exports to America have increased about sevenfold, which is not bad. That's East Asian rates of growth. Over the same period, Europe's been running the Everything But Arms scheme, and our export, and Africa's garment exports to Europe have fallen, absolutely. So much for our scheme. Right? The devil in all trade policy is in the details. And I won't bore you with the details of why their scheme works and ours doesn't. But the details of our trade policy scheme are not working. They're wrong. The European community has a chance to rethink that, because it's now getting into these things called economic partnership agreements with Africa. And that's a chance to rethink and get them right. I've been working with the European Commission, and they've now understood the problem. And so there is movement here, there's policy movement. But there needs to be. So this is an example of where, in addition to aid, trade policy is hugely important. Trade policy opens or closes off opportunities for ordinary people to get out of this traditional focus on commodities and agriculture. Commodities and agriculture are kind of a hiding to nothing in my view. No country has developed just on agriculture, and commodities are very much a two-edged sword. So, trade policy matters. What else did the Czech Republic benefit from, and the other countries of the former Soviet Union over the last 20 years? They benefited from rules of governance, rules of political governance, and rules of economic governance that the European community set out. Right? To be a member of the European community, you have to be a democracy. You have to be a functioning democracy. You also have to adhere to a lot of economic conditions. Some of these economic conditions may be irritating, but in aggregate, in their totality, they're helpful for a transition economy to see what needs to happen. It's much easier to transit out of very poor economic policies, which is what all Eastern Europe started with, if you've got clear rules that you have to become aligned to. It makes that transition process faster and more secure. There is less room for policy reversals. Africa, over the last 20 years, hasn't had anything like that. There's been no equivalent to the rule structure and governance structure of the European community. And so the policy improvements have been slower, and there's been more prone to reversal, and so there's been a much less credible environment. And credibility matters because that shapes investment flows. So those are three big areas that the European community has offered, I think, very successfully to the transition of the former Soviet Union countries. Aid plus trade plus governance. And that's, to my mind, the minimum, as it were, package by which Europe can be useful to Africa. Let me turn to how the the global crisis has altered that story. Africa thought initially that it would sit out the global crisis. It thought, well, this is a financial crisis that generated, if you've got very sophisticated financial markets, thank God we haven't got very sophisticated financial markets, so we'll miss this one out. And that turned out not to be true. The transmission mechanisms in different societies were very different. In Africa, the fastest transmission mechanism turned out to be through the fall in commodity prices. And that happened very fast. Africa, which thought it would sit the crisis out, turned out to be in the front line of the crisis. And the reason was that the financial crisis panicked. This is a simplified story, but it's not a bad story. The financial crisis panicked households in America, households which were massively overextended in credit. They panicked and reduced their consumption, increased their savings. The first things that got cut in their expenditure were consumer durables. Where were those consumer durables manufactured? Not in America, it's given up manufacturing. They were manufactured in East Asia. So East Asia, by the fourth quarter of 2008, East Asia sees that orders from America are drying up. It's still exporting, it's meeting existing orders, but it's getting no new orders. And so straight away, as it sees it's getting no new orders, it stops its orders for commodities purchased in Africa. And because the supply chain is quite short, the fall in demand hits very fast. So the fall in demand for commodities actually hits faster than the fall in demand for consumer durables plays out. So Africa goes down before East Asia. By the fourth quarter of 2008, Africa finds it can't sell its commodities. And that even includes South Africa. I remember Trevor Manuel telling me that commodities were just stacked up on the docks, not with no purchasers. So that was the first hit. Now, how did that fall in commodity prices affect Africa? Because that was the major source of revenue for African governments. Their tax structure is designed basically to get revenue from natural resource exports, from commodity exports. And so that fall, both in prices and quantities, hit government revenues very hard. So that was a distinctive transmission route of the shock to Africa. Now, fortunately, that, although it was a hard hit, it's not been terribly persistent because commodity prices have come back up. Nevertheless, a number of African countries, their budgets were so fragile that that hit has destabilized them. So it was a short hit, but it was a destabilizing hit for some because the budgets are so fragile. That's now been supplemented by a number of other transmission mechanisms. One is through remittances. Because Africa hasn't provided credible opportunity to its citizens, millions of them have left Africa. And then they send remittances back. And that's become a very big flow of money into Africa, bigger than aid. But Africans, as immigrants into European and American labour markets, are often the marginal workers. And so as the labour market contracts, it's the immigrants who get thrown out of jobs. That's more pronounced in America than in Europe, because in America, the fall in employment has been a lot bigger than the fall in output, whereas in Europe, the fall in employment has been smaller than the fall in output. But immigrants tend to be concentrated in the sectors which have been most vulnerable to the recession, the construction sector, and such like. So, as African immigrants to America and Europe lose their jobs, their flow of remittances drops. So there's been a a revenue hit through commodities. There's been a remittance hit to ordinary African households. And then what's looming now is a fall in aid, because across the developed world, budgets are in very poor shape, and so there'll be a squeeze on aid flows. That will be, to a small extent, offset by new entrants into aid, such as the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic's becoming an aid donor. Yesterday, South Korea joined the DAC for the first time. So there's some new entrance into the provision of aid, but that's unlikely to quantitatively offset the fall in aid flows in the big players. The final transmission mechanisms of the shock to Africa have been through investor perceptions of risk, or I should say investor appetite for risk. During the boom times, global investors became very cavalier about risk. You might have noticed irrational exuberance and all that. That's ended. We've now got the opposite phenomenon, a desperate retreat into safety, a much heightened aversion to risk. And the immediate impact on Africa then played out in the very simplest forms of credit that the African private sector got from international banking, which is called letters of credit. Letters of credit are as old as the hills. They're the way that international trade is financed. So if you're an African exporter, you get a letter of credit which then provides you with finance whilst you're shipping your goods. That dried up. And it dried up very specifically for Africa. The emerging market economies as a whole found trade credit down somewhat, but Africa found trade credit down massively, because the international banks no longer wanted to deal with the African banks. Not that the African banks had problems. After all, where were the banking problems? It was in the international banks, not the African banks. But all of Africa is perceived as the riskiest region in the world, and so as the appetite for risk collapsed, it wasn't that Africa had got more risky, it's that aversion to risk had increased, and so the foreign banks just pulled back from their relations with African banks. And so trade credit dried up. Now I fear that the legacy effect for Africa of the crisis will be that risk aversion. I think that aversion to risk will persist amongst the international investor community for years. We won't go back to a irrational exuberance in a hurry. And if that aversion to risk persists, then it will play out in reduced investment flows for Africa. For years, Africa got very little investment. During the boom times, there was just starting to be serious investment inflows. Not big, but moderate investment inflows, and now that's drying up. The one area where it won't dry up is foreign investment for resource extraction. Yesterday I was in Paris addressing about 20 Chinese investors into Africa. And they're all dominated, focused on the resource extraction sector, and they're working in billions of dollars. And that will continue, the investment for resource extraction. But of course it will push Africa further and further into a structure of dependence upon resource extraction. What will be very hard to get is investment for diversification. Last night I was talking to a big multinational company that operates both as an oil company and in biofuels. They gave me the example that they can get finance for oil exploration in Africa, but they can't get finance to set up biofuel production in Africa. And as they said, the biofuel stuff would create thousands and thousands of jobs and the oil doesn't. So that's the legacy effect of the crisis, is it's going to be harder for Africa to attract risk capital, I think. Why does that matter? Because Africa is desperately short of investment. The fundamental reasons for divergence are in part that Africa just isn't investing enough. Investment as a share of GDP in Africa is about 20%. In Asia, it's about 40%. And so that difference just spells long-term divergence. Africa needs to raise its investment rate. There's another reason why Africa needs to raise its investment rate, in that increasingly government revenues, and indeed African income, is coming from the depletion of finite natural resources. So a lot of African revenue and income is coming from the depletion of assets. And if your revenue is coming from depletion of assets, you need to offset that depletion by the accumulation of other assets. And so revenues that are generated from natural resources should have a particularly high investment rate. So Africa probably needs a higher investment rate than Asia, but actually has a much lower one. So, what can the Czech Republic do in all this? Where do you fit? I think very obviously you're more important for your voice and your perspective than for your money. That's not to say don't provide any money, but it's to say your experience, having successfully gone through exactly the transition that the countries of the bottom billion need to go through, that experience is your real value. And what's more, because you were never a colonial power, you can speak without the contamination of guilt that has so messed up the relations of the big countries in Europe in their relations with Africa. And so you can bring honesty and experience, and that is very sorely needed in Europe's relations with Africa. Now, what does that imply for how you engage with your development systems? I've looked at your development systems program. A little over half of it is given through multilaterally rather than bilaterally. And I think that's sensible. That as a multilateral player, and that means through the European Community, through the UNDP, through the World Bank, as a multilateral player, you bring your voice into these big organizations that need a new perspective. And the perspective and experience you have is just the perspective that they need. Guilt-free, honest advice and shared experience on the process that you've been through. So, multilateral more than bilateral. And your own perspective, which then you use through your voice in these multilateral agencies. Let me draw to a close by turning on one or two sort of practical instances of how the multilaterals, and especially the European Union, could, I think, have more productive relations. And let me go back to the idea that a sensible use of our of what we can bring is to use multiple instruments. It's not just about aid. The old model of guilt-ridden giving of money is a disastrous strategy, in my view. Money's part of what we have to offer, and we should offer it and we should be generous. But we should link it to those other powerful instruments, trade policy and governance, that the European community has used pretty successfully in the transitions in Eastern Europe. So let me give just a couple of practical instances of how we can link governance to our other instruments. Let's take one area which is very contested and fraught in Africa at the moment, and that is the conduct of elections. There was a wave of democratization in Africa during the early 1990s, and occasionally that has played out well, and often it hasn't. Governments learned how to manipulate elections to stay in power. There are exceptions to that. The election a year ago in Ghana, where very closely contested election, and we know it was an honest election because the government narrowly lost and stepped down. Right? So that's a sort of touchstone of an honest election. That is rare. Right? We can look across Africa, not just Africa, look at Afghanistan, what's just happened. Okay. Afghanistan's your biggest bilateral aid program, certainly. But across Africa, which is the subject of what I'm talking about today, Africa's not exceptional here. What you see is the creeping in of poor conduct, of misconduct in elections, through bribery, through intimidation, and through ballot fraud. Those are the big three instruments: bribery, intimidation, and ballot fraud. And we see them all. And that frustrates the accountability of government to citizens. We should not seek to make African governments accountable to us. That takes straight back to colonialism. But we can entirely legitimately seek for African governments to be accountable to their own citizens. Very often in the world's historic struggle for citizens to have government accountable to them, very often that effort has been international. Okay? Look at the international efforts to democratize South Africa, to make government accountable to citizens. Just as the international community engaged in that struggle, so it can legitimately engage in the struggle for the honest conduct of elections. Now, Europe already sends observers to elections around the world. It already comes out with assessments whether elections are free and fair or not. And as far as I can see, those assessments are not linked to any other actions whatsoever at the moment. It would be a simple matter to link our assessment of the conduct of elections to our actions in trade policy and aid. Joining up our policy instruments to try and reinforce accountability of government to citizen, which is at the heart of the struggle being played out in Africa. A struggle won in South Africa, but not won in much of the rest of the continent. Final example is the European Union gives a lot of money to Africa in a form called budget support. Budget support is basically the blank check. It's a check written to the government, and it can then do what it likes with it. Now, under what circumstances is that sensible? There are circumstances in which it is the best form of aid. And that is where you have a government that is properly accountable to its citizens, and where, as a result of that accountability, the government's budget process is honest and well-focused on citizens' needs. Where you've got that, it is much better just to hand over money to that government and let it decide what is the best place to spend the money. Much more sensible than doing projects or of trying to tell the government what it should be doing. And in some countries in Africa that holds. So in some countries that is budget support and that works. And in other countries, the European Union does budget support where none of those conditions hold. The government isn't accountable to citizens and the budget process has no integrity. I remember I used to work on Chad, and the European Community gave a load of budget support to Chad, knowing full well that what the government of Chad would spend it on was armaments, which it duly did. Did we really mean to buy a load of arms for such a troubled country? That's what we did. That's what we did with our budget support to Chad. I think that was a great folly. And so we need to link budget support to some minimum conditions of accountability. Accountability in two senses. There's accountability of citizens, of government to citizen through the electoral process. But there's also the integrity of the budget process. So one idea I've been floating recently is that budget processes should be verified and certified as to whether they are whether they have integrity, internal integrity. That basically means whether the money is looted or not. Amazingly, the International Monetary Fund already does these assessments, but it never actually then says yes or no. It just does the assessments and does a report, and that's it. There's no yes or no. And so those assessments are not linked at all to whether budget support is provided. So I floated this idea of linking those assessments, forcing the IMF or some other agencies to say, yes, these budgets have financial integrity. They work to the same sort of standards as budgets in the Czech Republic. I floated that idea with my friends in ministries of finance in Africa, and so far they've all said, please push this idea forward. The reason is, they say, we know actually if our systems were subject to certification, at the moment they wouldn't pass. And we know how to fix them, and that would just give us the leverage to fix them. And so that's an instance of linking our budget support to our scrutiny. We're doing scrutiny, but we're not linking it to anything. That would have these two advantages. One is it gives a pressure point for the people fighting for change within Africa. And secondly, where budgets are certified, it removes any excuse for doing anything other than budget support. So where budgets are certified as satisfactory for budget support, the donors can get out of the kitchen. Stop trying to tell African governments what policies to adopt. Stop doing projects. Just give the money to African governments. So that's just two practical suggestions, but there are a whole class of things that can be formulated in which there's a linking between our trade policies, our governance policies, and our aid. Remember, in all this, we are nothing more than marginal players. The struggles are internal struggles in Africa. We cannot develop Africa no matter how much money we provide.